Hello students, this is just a quick overview of some of the theories of lifespan development we've covered for those of you who weren't in class before talking about the discussion board. So this is just really focused on the content that you're going to be discussing in the discussion board, a quick reminder of some of the theories of development. So if you were in class earlier this week, don't worry about watching this video, jump straight forward and you can start actually doing the discussion board. Your actual posts. So, at the beginning of chapter 16, we start off talking about Erikson's theory in late adulthood. That's integrity versus despair. Hopefully you remember and you can think back, maybe take a second right now to pause and think about theories and times in the lifespan that Erikson thought about. So, any that come to your mind at all? So this one in late adulthood is called integrity versus despair. We talked about in adolescence identity, trying to find your identity. We talked about earlier in the lifespan trust versus mistrust. So Erikson's had a stage theory about different socio-emotional things that you might experience at different points in your life, or that you really, from Erikson's view, that you had to meet these socio-emotional steps, or your development was kind of stagnant, could lead to disorders, things like that. What we've talked about in the class is that this, while Erikson made some really good observations and created one of the first developmental theories across the lifespan, a lot of these observations we see happen earlier than the Erikson thought. We also talked about how Piaget's theories across cognitive development across the lifespan, a lot of those happen earlier than Piaget thought. Since we have better methods now, we can test these things. But also for Erikson specifically, a lot of these crises that Erikson talked about were not necessarily as serious as Erikson thought. So one thing that you might do if you have that despair that you haven't been the kind of person you wanted to throughout your life, using life review. So look back at memories, reinterpret, evaluate those things. You might do something like reminiscence therapy. And we talk about this more in chapter 16. So I won't go into too much depth on these topics. The main point is Erikson. So here is a little bit of a review of the different stages we've talked about throughout the lifespan. If any of these don't sound familiar to you, maybe go back and review your notes for them. So infancy, we've got trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame and doubt when you're a little older, initiative versus guilt, and it talks about like key questions that a person might be asking themselves at these times. School age, industry versus inferiority, identity versus role confusion. So hopefully you remember that one. What we've found out is that identity development, while it can happen as early as say like 13 or 14, for most people it's sometime between the ages of say 16 and like 25 that they settle on an identity for a first time. And it's not, so here we've got success leads to an ability to stay true to yourself, failure leads to role confusion and a weak sense of self. So it's not necessarily as critical or as negative as Erikson might have made it out to be. Then we've got intimacy versus isolation. Failure of that one is loneliness and isolation, which could be a case, but for most people, if they don't have a close, intimate relationship with a partner, which is usually what that was focused on, they might have close, intimate relationships with friends. They might not feel lonely or isolated. So hopefully you remember some of these. So generativity versus stagnation, we recently talked about that in middle adulthood, and ego identity versus despair. So this is one theory of lifespan development of how socio-emotional factors play into your behaviors, challenges, things that might go well, things like that. So let's also talk about the lifespan in general. So we've talked about these times and how we've broken it apart. So hopefully when you see this chart again, which is funny when I saved it as a PDF rather than being a dot, these are all little film clappers. So hopefully as you look at these stages in life, you can think of prenatal. What's an important thing we talked about in prenatal? Teratogens is maybe one that comes to your mind. In infancy, what's something that we talked about? Reflexes might be something that comes to your mind. Early childhood, maybe you think of empathy or something like that. So hopefully when you look at each of these time periods in life and how we've kind of broken it up, you remember some of the things we've discussed. So this discussion board assignment is helping you to review and think about lifespan as the whole lifespan. Because at this point, now we're in the last chapter of late adulthood, and next chapter will be death and dealing with death. So for this discussion board, I want you to think about your own lifespan development theory. So you might borrow from ones that we've talked about. So one that I've talked about many times is Bronfenbrenner's bioecological systems theory. So any individual is affected most by the context directly around them. So their family, their school, their friends, the people they're interacting with on a daily or maybe weekly basis. And then the exosystem is what, like economic systems, mass media, political systems, government, all of these, maybe laws, for example, have an impact on how we interact with the people around us. So maybe because of the economic systems, more of your family are working than would have been with the other economic systems, or working more jobs, for example. Maybe there are laws or things that a culture wouldn't be able to do because of certain laws or things like that. So with this though, these laws, these economic systems, these educational systems, the mass media, it all filters through generally the people that we're interacting with day in and day out. So that's how the exosystem interacts with the microsystem. Then the macrosystem is those norms and values of a culture. It's kind of a really big, broad umbrella that affects things like government and economic systems and media, and that affect us as an individual generally through the people we're directly interacting with. And this is all happening throughout time. So that's one of the most common models and theories around lifespan development. So this one's a theory. This next one is more a model, so it's using that same overarching theory of systems, and it's a different shaped model, like a visual representation, where we can see a focus on bidirectional interactions. So these double-sided arrows. So an individual might affect their school might affect them. So you can make changes or changes in how teachers interact with you. So as you interact more positively, maybe they interact more positively, things like that. So that bidirectional interaction is an important piece that was added on from Lerner here. But it's still under this general theory, Bronfenbrenner's bioecological systems theory. So with that, hopefully you remember these things. We've talked about it quite a few times. Another thing we've talked about a lot is the developmental cascades model. So essentially that, maybe we'll say over here is kind of negative outcomes. Over here is positive outcomes. So at any time, your genetics might be kind of pointing you towards negative outcomes, but maybe you have social supports that point you a little more towards positive outcomes. So risk factors might try to push you this way. Protective factors might try to push you this way. So as you're aging, for example, you're losing maybe some of your bone density and muscle mass, so you might have a little less ability to walk around or run. But if you are working on those things, you're doing protective factors like exercising, eating right. Those might be protective factors that aren't going to take you all the way down this way. So any of these choices you make or features of a context that you're interacting with can point you one way or another. So really these two here, learners and the developmental cascades, are two different models to think about this theory in general. So another theory that we've talked about quite a few times is Vygotsky's sociocultural theory. Usually I bring it up with an emphasis and focus on this zone of proximal development, but the sociocultural theory as a whole talks about how a society and culture delivers things to an individual and helps them develop over time in ways that should be beneficial to that community that they're in. Community being, could be small, could be really broad. So with this zone of proximal development, this is what you're capable of now, what you can do with help, and what you can't do. What you're wanting is scaffolding to help build that circle of what you can do and that circle of what you can do with help. So hopefully you remember a lot of these theories. I just wanted to bring them up again, and also Piaget's stages of cognitive development, so sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, formal operational, just as a reminder of the different theories that we've talked about. Later on, researchers added post-formal operational thinking, so Piaget really focused on adolescence and earlier, versus later researchers added on post-formal thinking in early adulthood, and then there's not really stages after that. About that time is when we were seeing the paradigm shift to these developmental systems theories and other models as well. But that gives you a little refresher on some of the theories we've talked about in the class. So what I want you to do for your discussion board is kind of a similar thing. So it's similar to a class activity, but in this case you're doing it all yourself. So I'm actually going to pull up the instructions for the discussion board so you can see these. So review notes about theories that we've talked about over the course of the semester. Think about some of the most critical pieces that you would include that you think are most important across the lifespan. So if you're like, well, you know, I actually really like Erickson's, but I think maybe we should include some aspects of genetics in there. Genetics is an important piece to put in there. Or maybe something like physical growth and the neural development that's happening is really important, and that's kind of missing from Erickson. So you can combine things or mash them up. You don't have to talk about how this theory is relevant in infancy, middle, so you don't have to do like stage-like and really detailed explain it. This whole total post, the first post, should be about 220 words or more. So with that, you're not going to have a ton of detail on infancy and a ton of detail on early childhood. You're going to be talking about the main components that you want in your theory. So is your theory stage-like? Is it borrowing from Bronfenbrenner and it's all these bubbles of, we've got culture on top, or maybe culture is more important. Maybe you think culture is interacting closer to the microsystem or something like that. So make sure that the points that you make are relevant across the entire lifespan. So genetics, for example, is one thing that's relevant at every different point in the lifespan. So overall, what are the most important components in lifespan development? Are you going to focus on biology, cognition, socio-emotional development, the self, relationships? Like, what are the most important pieces? So that's what you're going to be talking about in your original post, which is going to be about 220 words or more, and then respond to at least 2 other students by the end of the week. So by Saturday, respond to them. So essentially this first post is due the same day we would have class, basically midnight, the same day we would have class, and your follow-up posts are due Saturday just before midnight. So make your response when you're commenting on other students' posts, doing things like, oh, I really like this piece of your theory, or that you would include in your theory, but I think also maybe adding this could make it even better. Or you might question them, so why did you add this? You mentioned it, but you didn't really talk about it. So dive deeper. These reply posts should be about 120 words or more. So it shouldn't be something like, oh, really good post, I liked it, or really good post, I'd said the same thing. So it should be a lot more in depth with that. So try to expand their learning, try to ask questions, add more things to their ideas. So it should hopefully be similar to the discussions we have in class, just it's in an online discussion board format. So that should give you a bunch of information to get started on that. So hopefully if you were in class the other day, you didn't watch this whole thing, otherwise it was a lot of repetition. So go and do those discussion boards. First post due the midnight, the day we would have normally had class, and the follow-up post due Saturday at midnight.